In today's video, I got the opportunity to speak with Ohnearohs, who is an AI artist. He shares a lot of his work through social media sites such as Instagram. Throughout his life, he has struggled with obsessive compulsive disorder and is willing to share his story. So stay tuned for today's conversation with Ohnearohs, where we will talk about and answer questions such as what is OCD, what are some symptoms, and we'll dive into learning more about AI art and what impact will it have on society in the future. Hey there, Arma here, and welcome to a brand new Armavation Conversations. Today's conversation will be focused on mental health awareness. So I'm joined by an awesome individual who is willing to share his experience with OCD, also known as obsessive compulsive disorder, and talk about his journey so far as an AI artist. So please, everyone, welcome the one and only Ohnearohs.
Hello, hello. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much once again, Ohnearohs, for taking the time to join this conversation. I truly appreciate it. And yeah, so let's get started. So from human being to human being, I've been asking my guests recently this question: how have you been doing? Like, how has this year been for you so far?
Um, Good, I would say. I think there's a lot to appreciate. Everyone had a hard time during COVID.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean I was definitely one of those people. And I had to do a lot to kind of rebuild my life because I mean, just everything kind of like for so many people kind of came down during COVID. And yeah, but I mean, I've really gotten to a point where I feel like I've built back better than before.
Yeah.
So I've been really doing well. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, definitely no problem. Like I feel like for me this year, it's been pretty challenging, but I feel like there's a lot of lessons I've learned that can help me in with my future journey. So I'm thankful for that. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's definitely been some interesting year. A lot of things have gone on.
Yes, it's been an interesting few years, definitely.
Okay. So yeah, let's get into you mentioned you were open to speaking about, your experience dealing with, OCD, and I'm interested in learning because I only know as far as what I know about OCD is it's not about necessarily like being clean, is more so like I guess like in a way maybe traumatic things from your past can like cause you to do things in a certain like format or pattern, and if that pattern is like disrupted in a way, it affects you mentally. That's all I really know. But
Yeah, I
but
think that's a good start, definitely.
okay.
Because you're right, a lot of people do tend to think of it as like being clean or like washing a lot or something like that. And those definitely can be symptoms or rituals that are involved in OCD, but they're not necessarily at the heart, they're not inherent to
Mm,
OCD.
okay.
It's usually the ritual of those things that's kind of what how the symptom displays itself. For some people, if it usually starts with, so like the obsessive compulsive dynamic usually starts with an obsessive or intrusive thought, which
Mhm.
then leads to a compulsive action or a ritual. And so where you might see like cleanliness or something is if maybe the intrusive thought is something to do with like germs. You might have this thought of like, oh no, I touched something that might be gross. What if that had COVID in it? And
Mhm.
then it just kind of leads into this slippery slope of worst case scenarios. And so it's usually an anxiety driven sort of obsession that then leads to how do I deal with that? How do I uh, kind of remediate that? And that's where the compulsion comes in,
Mhm.
where washing hands or something like that, if you do feel like maybe you touch something gross and you're like, oh man, that might be COVID, you quickly go to wash your hands. And for OCD people, if that is an obsession that they have, you might see them washing their hands, way more than the average person might in the same situation. And that's
Mhm.
generally how these things express themselves. Another common symptom is checking. Checking is for instance, this is a symptom that I have with the front door.
Okay.
I'm often I'm often concerned that the front door is not locked. And even though like I know like in my head I haven't gone anywhere or anything like that, there's always this intrusive thought of that door could be unlocked and someone could be coming in at any moment and I need to be able to prepare for that. And it's a thought that just comes in all the time. And for a lot of people, they'll have that thought and just kind of be like, well, no, I trust myself. But with OCD, there's this underlying feeling that you can't trust yourself and
Mm.
you have to go and check. And so that's a common one for me. I mean, me and my partner, as we're leaving the apartment, when I will watch her lock the front door, but I have to do it too. I have to also check the front door, shake it, make sure like if anyone was trying to force the door, they can't get in. And I mean, logically, when I hear myself saying that stuff out loud, I know that's not necessary,
Right.
but the intrusive thoughts drive those actions. They give you this feeling that if you don't check, the worst case scenario will happen. You'll find yourself later thinking, I should have checked.
Mm.
And so that's a common symptom. And but the rituals can really form in any fashion. I mean, less common symptoms might be like repeating things in a certain sequence or frequency, like maybe you feel the need to flick the light switch 3 times in order to
Okay.
turn it off. Like that might be a ritual someone has, and the obsessive thought can sometimes be completely unrelated. Usually with OCD, there is kind of a certain element of delusion
Right.
where I know that these issues that I have obsessive thoughts about are mostly non-issues, but there's just this overwhelming feeling that they are very, very real things.
Mm.
I could probably think of another 100 things. I have obsessions about my cats. I have 2 cats. I'm often worried, like, for instance, if I put um, clothes in the laundry and into the washing machine, I once read years ago about a woman who accidentally put like her cat in the laundry machine,
Oh my
and
goodness.
right. And but you hear a story like that and you're like, wow, that's outrageous. And most people will be like, well, I trust myself. I know when there's a cat in the laundry and when there's not. But I'll have moments after I do the laundry where I'm like, I didn't check to see if there's a cat in there. And
Right.
so I have to, because I heard that story, there's now always this intrusive thought where I will be doing something totally unrelated. But even if I checked once, but maybe I haven't checked again recently and I still hear the laundry, if I hear that sound, I think, and maybe there's like a loud clunk because of what's in there. I mean, I
Mm.
just have the image immediately intrude my brain that there's a cat in there. And so
Mm.
then I go around my apartment and I look for my cats and they're always okay. But that's just an example. I mean, I've
Yeah.
never had that personal experience, but knowing that it could happen is enough to drive me into a ritual to prevent it.
Oh wow. That's very interesting. Like I also want to ask, do you think that like depending on the person that the symptoms are different, like based on what you said, like is it like certain things that in a way can trigger you, like you mentioned the story about the cat, could there be like a story that you hear you're like, oh no, or is it just like every story that you hear that seems like devastating can trigger those obsessive thoughts?
It's definitely different for different people.
Mm.
There was, um, you may or may not have seen it. I think it was like a TLC show where they had a reality show with people who had OCD. And I remember
Mm.
some of the stories that they told. There was this older man on the show who said he heard the phrase, see a penny, pick it up, all day you'll have good luck. Common
Mm.
phrase, we've all heard it
Yeah.
probably at one point or another. He hears that phrase and he's like, after that, I could not ignore a single penny on the ground.
Wow.
And I mean, so it can be trauma driven. It can just be, I mean, sometimes I think trauma definitely plays a factor into how severe your OCD is and how it can represent itself. But um, it doesn't necessarily have to be. It
Mhm.
can be just these, it's often a bid for control, I think. And I think
Mhm.
that is sometimes a reaction to trauma. you might hear the phrase "see a penny, pick it up," and then you have this feeling every time that you pick up a penny, like I followed through with an action, it happened, I was able to control this aspect of my life for a moment.
Right.
And yeah, and being able to like have that plan, like every time I see a penny, I'm going to pick it up, and then you follow through with it. You feel that sense of control every single time.
And that's the like the reliever is the like the constant questioning and like making sure everything's okay is kind of like a reliever in a sense.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, because there is so much out of all of our control, and when you have OCD, you can at times feel as though you're sort of a slave to your emotions and your compulsions. And so, yeah, I mean, having those compulsions and it does a lot to relieve those emotions just because you know that you're in control. You did that, and I
Mm.
think that in itself can be enough to kind of call. And that's why sometimes some OCD symptoms represent themselves in really strange ways. Like I mentioned with like the light switch flicking. I mean,
Yeah.
for some people that can be like a bid for control to be like, I do this every single time. It's a planned action and then I execute it. That's my sense of control.
Mm.
And so yeah, but on the other side, I mean, when you have trauma, I mean, that is definitely, I think early trauma is often a case for most people who present OCD symptoms.
Yeah.
And um, yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily think of like a personal example where I mean, because I have had trauma early in my life, but I so to talk about OCD, I think I also have to kind of branch out a little bit and mention I have BPD, which is borderline personality disorder,
Okay.
and often it's not uncommon for people to have both OCD and BPD. There are some symptoms that kind of overlap, and they're two disorders that kind of feed into each other.
Mm.
So that adds another layer of difficulty. And with early trauma, I can definitely see the link between that and how my borderline symptoms
Mhm.
present themselves. But in both cases, for instance, it's common to question core concepts of who you are in OCD and borderline.
Okay.
And examples of that would be like sexual orientation, gender orientation, or other things like personal philosophies, ideologies. Um, I mean, there are things I've struggled with my entire life, core concepts that have felt elusive to me. And some of that is intrusive thoughts that are correlated with OCD. A common example would be people who question if they're gay because they have a lot of intrusive gay thoughts. And those
Okay.
people are not necessarily gay, but those thoughts can present themselves very early.
Right.
So, with people who have OCD, they may find themselves questioning their sexuality their entire life because they have these thoughts that they may not necessarily want or definitely don't want, but they imagine them, and that's one of the most difficult parts I think of
Now,
OCD is having thoughts just come in that seem like you can't really fight back against very well.
right. Now I've also heard there is a there is another side of it where people who have had like I guess chronic anxiety that could would you say that could play a role in some people that may think they have
Yeah,
OCD or have OCD?
I think especially if you are early in your self-discovery and you're just learning about issues you may struggle with. Some people have anxiety for a long time and don't really realize that's what they're struggling with.
Mm.
And anxiety is definitely a symptom of OCD. I would say it's inherent for sure.
Okay.
I mean, I'm blanking on the names of certain people. There's a comedian who is she's come out as saying that she's had OCD her whole life. An example she gave was at an early age she would have these really intrusive violent thoughts, which is also common and it's something I've struggled with. And you may not be a violent person. She wasn't a violent person, but you just because you have intrusive thoughts, they often skew as taboo as possible.
Mm.
So she would have thoughts of like stabbing her sister to death. And because, I mean, even though she knew she wasn't going to do that on some level, especially when you're young, when you have thoughts like that over and over and over,
Mhm.
you think they're part of you. You think they're genuine thoughts that you have. And so she An example she gave of the compulsion that would follow those thoughts was she would sing a song to herself that was just along the lines of like, "Don't stab your sister. I'm not going to stab my sister." And I mean, that's an example of how those thoughts can present themselves and how like you kind of get this bid for control where you're like, okay, if I sing about it and I kind of clear it from my mind, then it's no longer an issue. I have that kind of I have that control for a moment. And so um
So that was like that was her coping mechanism in a way.
right.
Yeah.
And right, exactly. And so things like that, if you're young, I mean, when I was young, I was diagnosed with anxiety. And that was around like 12, maybe. And it was an ongoing journey. I started seeing a general practitioner who mentioned that I had anxiety. And then at a later point, we did a different test for bipolar. And then he said, "It sounds like you have this too." I started seeing a clinical psychologist who told me I had ADHD. And
Hmm.
it just kind of, right. I mean, it just, there's a lot of help to be had in the medical, in the mental health field, but it's difficult. It's difficult because a lot of symptoms do overlap,
Right. Yeah.
and and doctors, as much as we want to see them as unbiased parties, they have biases.
Mhm.
And my clinical psychologist would argue with my general practitioner about what medications I should be taking because especially when you start to get to that point with ADHD, for example, at that time, I'm not sure what is generally prescribed for it now, but at that time, Adderall was generally the standard for being prescribed to people with ADHD. And that was really in direct opposition of all the other medications I was taking because Adderall is it's a stimulant. I mean, it's
Mhm.
gonna get you amped, and then all the other medications I was taking were their purpose was to do the exact opposite.
Hmm.
So I mean, that was tough. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't until like my early 20s that I started seeing doctors who were consistently telling me it sounds like you have borderline personality disorder and it sounds like you have OCD. And the more I did research on those things, the more I felt like that's what I was dealing with.
Right.
And it's been personally difficult for me to kind of follow up with that journey. Um, I personally have not found a lot of success with medications. And, when you have kind of an overarching neurodivergent issue like the combination of OCD and BPD, it can be really hard to medicate for the reasons I just mentioned. You might have symptoms that need medicating, and your medications do the exact opposite things.
Mhm.
So a lot of people tend to do what's called behavioral rehabilitation therapy or cognitive rehabilitation therapy, which is changing how you think, changing how you act.
Okay.
And yeah, and so that's been a big part of my journey since then. Um, so yeah, I mean, it can definitely be a long road, and you might find along the way that doctors tell you different things, but um, I think it's worth it, to keep traveling down that path and discovering yourself.
Yeah, but you answered my question because I was just going to ask like what was your background story with the development of you having OCD and like how all began and like how did you
Mhm.
learn how to cope with it. So thank you for answering that.
Yeah, yeah, for
So
sure. I'm ahead of you.
so like what you like learning about being diagnosed and learning about your symptoms, OCD, like how did it affect those around you, your relationship with your friends, family, co-workers?
I think for the most part, people who knew me were like, "Yeah, that makes sense."
Mhm.
I would tell them I've been told I have OCD, and they're like, "Well, yeah, totally." Because I mean, the symptoms, I mean, I've had so many of the classic symptoms throughout my life. One of my first jobs was at a Domino's Pizza, and I mean, one thing that people would catch me doing all the time is one of those classic OCD things of arranging things and
Okay.
making sure that they were all in order. And that's not really something I struggle with as much now, but especially then in my earlier years you would see me with like all the pizza boxes, straightening them up. And when I
Mhm.
would make pizza, Um, my manager used to joke that it seemed like I was painting the Picasso when I would try to put on sauce because I mean everything I did was just so meticulous and
Right.
I mean it was very exact. And yeah, did I answer your question? Sorry,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah. You're fine.
realizing
You're fine. Yeah. Do you feel like were there any situations where you felt like the people around you maybe got frustrated or like tired even though they were aware of that you had OCD, like maybe your coworkers or maybe manager was maybe upset with you for doing something at a certain point in time?
definitely. I mean, that was at that time way before I even knew for sure I had OCD. I mean, so many
Okay.
people around me mentioned it
Mhm.
when just observing me that I was like, I probably do. And
Mhm.
then, I wouldn't know for sure until I saw him later. But I mean, all the people who, in my experience, get upset with you because of symptoms you're expressing will pretty much feel that way whether or not you tell them about your your condition.
Mhm.
In my experience, people who need that excuse, who need to hear you say, "Oh, I have OCD, so I have to do this." The people who need to hear that generally are not really that interested in your excuse anyway. I mean,
Oh, okay.
it's that's been my experience. I mean, even when people, I mean, because again, I mean, people at work, for instance, to take a specific example, like I just mentioned with Domino's, I mean, just watching me, they're like, "Oh, he's neurodivergent. I mean, he's got OCD." It was just clear in everything that I did, but that did not stop anyone from being upset about it.
Okay.
I mean, even though it was obvious, I mean, it was, they're a business, so they're like, "Hey, that's taking too long because you're being too meticulous."
Okay.
And there's always that push of like you have to find a way to be normal.
Mhm.
And
Of course, yeah.
right, I mean, and there's that push from everyone around you, like you have to find a way to align with societal norms.
Yeah.
Friends, are a different story. I mean, most of the friends I had throughout my life who really stayed on, who've been with me the whole time, were patient people, people who knew how to empathize and how to how to understand someone who might be going through something that's vastly different than their own experience. And
Mhm.
I've been lucky to keep those people throughout my life. But, I mean, for some people, it's just, even after a period of time, it's just exhausting.
Oh,
And
right. Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, I think the symptoms themselves definitely affect your relationships. I
Yeah.
don't know really how much the actual term affects their views on that. To me, it seems like hearing your diagnosis really does very little to change their opinion on your symptoms.
Right. Cuz even I feel like what like I've struggled with like anxiety but it's gotten better now. But I feel like even with some people, not only myself, but people I know that had anxiety, there were some people that were kind of like impatient about it and they didn't really understand it. And
Yeah.
it's like you tell them like what you're feeling, and they're like, "Are you serious? Like you feeling like that again?" It's like you don't
Right.
understand. You don't
Yes.
understand.
Yes. And yeah, I mean that's very common with anxiety, especially to have recurring anxieties, things you're often anxious about. And that goes doubly so for OCD. I mean,
Mm,
there's so many issues that I've worried about for years.
yeah.
And my partner even she's so patient, but I mean, she definitely has points where she's like, we've had this conversation.
Right.
Like,
Mhm.
to give an example of, I tend to have the classic symptoms of a hypochondriac. As soon as I feel any amount of pain, I'm like, it's a heart attack or, it's cancer.
Yeah.
And that's definitely tough for my partner where it's like I'm like I feel it again. It was in my arm this time and she's like it's just a feeling. It happens.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, but what if it's not this time? And
Yeah.
it's it can be really, really frequent. And yeah, for a lot of people that is exhausting. They're like, I
Mhm.
can't reassure you 24/7.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky to have someone in my life who's willing to do that all the time, and it helps. I
It
think that's the
does.
thing that
Yeah.
people don't that I think that's something people don't see. For a lot of people who are neurotypical, they think that help is just being like, forget about it. Forget about it. Everything's okay.
Mhm.
And that's generally not what's helpful. What's helpful is to have someone listen to you, understand where you're coming from, and try to lead you to what's logical using your own logic. Someone who's really willing to get in your head and be like, with my partner, for instance, she's like, we've been here many times before. You know what the outcome is every time. And I'm like, I'm always okay. And she's like, yeah. So she's just picked up on like the patterns I need, the communication I need, and that's what's really helpful. I think
Yeah.
so often in my life I've had people react in like a just forget about it, and when you're talking about your anxieties, they're like, don't worry about it. And it's like, well, I am. So I
Yeah.
can't just not anymore.
Yeah, it's like you're talking
So
to a wall. You need a real like supportive group of people that are understanding. Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah, definitely. So so I asked you like have people you've interacted with been like easily frustrated, but what about you? Have you felt like when you're going through your thoughts and everything, your reoccurring thoughts, do you display like your frustration and more like I guess in a way where everyone can see it, or you kind of like, or do you like get upset or mad like quietly to yourself, if that made sense?
Right. It does make sense.
Okay.
So and this is where I might start talking a little bit about having borderline personality disorder also, because a classic symptom of that is um, it's really easy to um, there's something called splitting with borderline personality disorder, and splitting is this idea where let's say a person. I think it usually happens with a person. Maybe you meet somebody new, and while getting to know that new person, you're just like, man, they're so great, and man, they have all these things that they like that I also like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you put them on a pedestal. And for a lot of people with BPD, it's hard to do gray areas. You meet someone,
Okay.
you put them on a pedestal because you're like, they're so great, they're so awesome, and I love that they're in this influence in my life. The moment they do something that's like even a small, like you find out that like you see them spit on the ground or something, you're like, oh, that's uncouth. And then
Yeah.
suddenly your opinion of them drops completely. It's
Okay.
common with BPD. You go from being like, they're the best, you see them spit on the ground, you're like, why have I ever spent
Right.
time with this person?
So it's like
And
high expectations in a way.
right. And so you can also split with yourself.
Okay.
So I at times am like, this was very common when I was young. I would have like these manic phases of like, I'm the best, I'm indestructible, I can do anything. And this would lead me to get into a lot of trouble because that's the delusion. I would believe all of these grandiose things I was telling myself. And then the moment I disappoint myself somehow, I kind of bottom out. I'm like, wow, I am the worst. Why did I ever think I was the best? I'm clearly terrible.
Wow, that's
And
interesting.
yeah, it very, very common. That's probably one of the biggest symptoms I've struggled with my whole life is splitting with people, concepts, and myself.
Mm.
Um, Probably mostly myself. I mean, I'm the thing that's constant in my life. So I mean, it's just so easy to have moments of like I'm killing it, I'm doing it, and then when something goes wrong, I'm like, oh, I'm the source of all my problems.
Okay.
And
So that plays
yeah,
into
so
the OCD, like where if you have these thoughts and you're like, oh, that kind of
right,
okay.
yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it can create a loop. I mean, looping thinking is very common with OCD, where you're just like, my life is terrible, it's all my fault. My life is terrible, it's all my fault. I did this thing and it was terrible and it's all my fault. You
Mm.
know, so and to get more to your question, I definitely have moments where, especially if I kind of see myself coming up against the limitations of my ability to handle my neurodivergency, I feel disappointed. I feel disappointed in myself. And that disappointment can lead to that sort of bottoming out feeling of being like, oh, right, I'm terrible. I
Okay.
forgot about that. I forgot that I'm terrible. And yeah, I mean, and with those feelings, you could definitely see it on my face. I mean, when you get to this extreme level of like negativity, I mean, I just like most people would, I am visibly depressed. I tend to go from being either like very talkative and kind of extroverted to that moment of, oh, right, I'm terrible, totally introverted. And so it's often very, very obvious to the people around me. I
Okay.
can think of a couple examples. And they seem so small when I say them out loud and I think back on them. But I remember once in my early 20s, I was at a baseball game with one of my roommates. And again, especially then, having that sort of manic energy, I was very often just talking, 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 and really just believing that I was great. And then my roommate had this moment where he's like, "Man, all you do is talk." And
Oh.
for him it was kind of like a lighthearted barb, which wasn't necessarily uncommon between us. But there's just something about it in that moment where I was like, "Oh, all I do is talk. That's true. I really need to shut up." And on that
Mm.
note, I'm actually terrible. Now that I think about it, I forgot that I was terrible. And so it goes right back to that feeling of like, "Oh, right, I'm awful." And I mean, I'm at this game with him, so he sees the shift immediately from like talking and energetic to just now I'm completely shutting out the entire outside world.
Right.
And I remember him turning to me like a little bit later, being like, "Hey, man, just so you know, I was just kidding about that comment. You know,
Yeah.
you don't talk all the time, man. It's all good." And
Mm-hmm.
I just even then, I mean, once you get to that point, negativity like that can be such a strong feeling. I'm already there. So I mean, he's made the comment, even though he's like, "Hey, man, I'm sorry about that." I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah.
And that's been something in particular I've really tried to work on because I've recognized that at times as also being unfair to other people.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, so that shift, I mean, it still happens. People definitely notice it, but
It's kind
I
of like
think
the damage has already been done kind of situation.
right, and that's something I've worked on a lot. I mean, I think I've gotten a lot better at being like, people say things, and I know that I say things that are not always well thought out, and letting go has been a really big part of the cognitive and behavioral rehabilitation that I've been trying to go through. Just letting go of you know
Yeah,
other
that's
people's
good. Yeah.
expectations. Yeah, I mean it's tough. It's
It's
something
tough.
you work
Definitely
at
tough. Yeah.
every day. Yeah, you got to work at it all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
Yeah, but at least you're trying, and you're like to all like problems. Is the first thing is recognizing the issue. So it is
Right.
good that you're definitely working on that. I think that's a great thing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So let me ask you, what do you think happens if OCD goes untreated?
OCD, when it's left untreated, um, as I was saying, my experience has been a little atypical. I was getting treatment for mental health. So I was this is where circumstances also come to play because in order to get mental health treatment, you need resources,
Yeah.
you need money and insurance, and
Mm-hmm.
which also costs money.
Right.
And so when I was 18, um, that was around 2008. So I'm dating myself. And um, so my father, he was a designer for homes, like an architectural designer. And being in the housing market around that time in 2008, you may or may not remember, the housing market totally crashed. A lot of companies in that industry downsized or just completely shut down. And my father was one of those people in that industry who he was a head design engineer for his company, and they just couldn't afford to have him work anymore.
Okay.
So when he loses his job, we lose our insurance. So
Mm.
around 18, I'd received mental health treatment up until that point in the form of taking different medications and seeing a clinical psychologist as well as my general practitioner. And honestly, during that whole time, I felt that my clinical psychologist alone was vastly more helpful than any of the medication I took.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of that is because of the nature of those medications. Eventually, my general practitioner told me that in order to deal with the severity of mood swings that I was having, he recommended lithium.
Okay.
Lithium is a potent drug in that field. Um, and when I go back to doctors now and mention my OCD, they always bring it up. The thing is, you need blood tests every month if you take lithium because of damage that it can do to your body.
Okay.
And that was where I stopped. I mean, I just couldn't even wrap my head around the idea that I was taking medication that could be that bad for me.
Mm.
Um, I mean, for me, it was just like, what? I mean, surely I can do more good on my own. And that was and wasn't true. I a lot of people with OCD and BPD, as I mentioned, they go into cognitive and behavioral rehabilitation therapy because honestly, therapy and changing the way you think and behave, I think for almost anybody is probably going to be the best route. I think prescription drugs can be helpful in some circumstances. There are a lot of people who report positive feedback for taking prescription drugs. In a lot of cases, these people have to take them short term, sometimes long term, but they swear it helps. And for those people, I think they should keep doing it. And I think that anyone who wants to go down that avenue should try it.
Okay.
But it's not the end all be all answer, medication.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think treatment, the idea of treatment and what that should look like really differs from everybody.
Okay.
And I mean it's always a personal effort. I mean, I think you have to put in the effort to think and act differently if you really want recovery or if you really want to mitigate the symptoms.
Okay. We mentioned before, like, being able to understand that there is an issue there and then taking actions to, try to seek help is a
Hmm.
big step. So,
Yeah. And to kind of build on what we were just talking about.
hmm,
Um, so I've kind of mentioned on and off about like the efficacy of mental health as it is in America.
yeah.
And I mean, I think there's an argument there for how effective it can be. And I think it's usually correlated to your socioeconomic status. I found that once I lost my insurance and I tried to seek out free clinical help,
Hmm.
um, the quality was significantly lower. I mean, I was
Mm.
really floored by the lack of expertise with the people that I worked with. I remember one of the first times I walked into a free clinic after going to a psychologist that I went to through my insurance for like 8 years. I went to a free clinic, and one of the only bits of advice that I got that the therapist was trying to push was she said, "Well, what if you tried some breathing exercises?" And
Ah.
right, I almost laughed in her face. I'm thinking to myself, like, I've been dealing with this my entire life.
Oh,
I've been going to
wow.
therapy for almost a decade. Do you think I've never tried a breathing exercise? And I mean that I went to other free clinics. I went back to that one a couple of times. At one point, they replaced the therapists with TV screens, not even really good quality ones. So I
Wow.
mean, there's suddenly a huge disconnect. I mean, you're like seeing someone on screen. There's like a bit of a delay, and the
Yeah.
quality's not great. You barely feel like you're talking to somebody. And I feel like that's really a good metaphor for how mental health is treated in America overall. Without
Mm.
money, you get like the McDonald's version of it. You
Yeah.
you get like, the version that's like it's not even like satisfying or even really that good for you. I mean, again, I'm sure there's people who go that route
Yeah.
and they find help and I hope that they are successful in that endeavor. But my experience personally, there's a huge quality difference. And even the way we treat it medicinally. Um, so to talk about neurodivergency in general, or I guess first I'll talk about OCD.
Hmm.
One un one not very well known way to help mitigate symptoms is with the use of psychedelic mushrooms. And there are studies on this. People who had OCD take psychedelic mushrooms, and psychedelic mushrooms um, they help your brain open up new neural pathways. Your brain is always seeking this path of least resistance, and it goes through the same neural pathways, the same thought patterns. And when you have OCD, you want to break that. You want to break those thought patterns.
Wow.
And and so psychedelic mushrooms will help people with OCD form new thought patterns, healthier ones.
I,
And there are examples outside of even that, veterans who have PTSD, there have been studies on
yeah, I've
giving
heard
them
of that.
ecstasy. Yeah, right. So yeah, so I mean, we're seeing this become more and more well known.
Yeah.
I think that the pharmaceutical industry in America has pushed back on things that are not already established because of the systems that are already in place are making money for the people in control of the pharmaceutical industry. So they don't want to mess that up too much.
Mm.
And but these studies are renowned at this point. I mean, they're proven to work for at least certain groups of individuals. They definitely should be studied more. A lot of studies in America that are done on the efficacy of things like cannabis or psychedelic mushrooms or ecstasy, the efficacy of these things on people with neurodivergent issues, that is largely suppressed. A lot of the research that goes into these substances are done by, or they're funded by anti-drug groups or groups that are funded by the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay.
So I'm just, just to kind of remind everyone that, I mean, there's no one size fits all answer, and there's always new things coming about that show us new potential
Yeah, there's
ways for
different
people to cope.
pathways.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like closing out with this topic here, and I really appreciate you for, sharing your story and experience again with this, but what's some advice do you have for those that think they may have OCD based on some symptoms, or people who are actually suffering with OCD? Like, what are some, maybe, I know you touched on that, but maybe some other outlets or maybe websites you may know that could maybe help some people out there?
It's definitely good to try to reach out to a community of people who are dealing with the same thing.
Okay.
Like Reddit, for instance, has been really great for me looking into subreddits on OCD and borderline personality disorder. I found so many people who describe exactly what I'm feeling and exactly what I've thought,
Yeah.
the things I've gone through. It helps a lot to know that other people do struggle with what you're struggling with. I think
Okay.
that kind of community definitely reminds you that, like, I mean, when you're struggling with these things and you don't really see anyone else around you struggling with those same issues, it's so easy to convince yourself you're the only one. So I,
Right.
I think community is definitely big. I think having a good support system in general is just, it's vital to your personal growth.
Yeah, and I
Um,
was also amazed that, like, with all the mental health groups, like not only on Reddit but also Discord, like there's a lot of people all over the world going through similar things, and that really like was an eye opener for me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it
Y-
helps. It helps to
Yeah,
know that other people struggle with that stuff, and it's good to have a community of people who can understand where you're coming from. And I think that's really vital to mitigating symptoms and to fitting in more.
yeah, especially if you can't really afford, professional help as
Yeah.
well. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I would honestly argue that having a support system is probably the most important thing.
of course. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. So, thank you for that, Oneros. But I want to segue into you getting into AI art. And
Let's do it.
I always found, like, I've heard of AI art, but I didn't really know what too much about it. Like, I didn't know what was, like, how does it work? I don't know if there's, like, maybe some background functioning you have to do or coding. I'm not too sure, but
Mhm.
you know more than me. So yeah, let's
Yeah.
get into it then. So, in your own words, what does AI art mean to you?
So AI art at its core is a program
Okay.
that has a reference of material that it uses to combine stuff from that reference based on a prompt into art. So, um, to take a practical example, one really popular AI art engine is I believe it's pronounced DALL-E, DALL-E, and that one's been developed by Google, if I recall. And the idea is that, I mean, you literally type in like a bear on a skateboard, and then it generates a picture based on that prompt. And
Wow.
at first, the pictures were not very clear, and now they're really getting a lot better at predicting what an image should look like. So at its core, I mean, that's literally what it is. You type in the image you want, and it spits out a picture. And if you're lucky, it looks like what you typed in. And it really depends. Different engines are different. There's stability, or I'm sorry, stable diffusion,
Okay.
which is developed by Stable AI. It's very similar to DALL-E. There's Midjourney, which I believe they have like a proprietary AI engine, and Disco Diffusion. I forget who develops that one, but they're all different engines. They all have different libraries of references upon which they draw from to create images.
Okay, so
Um,
are these free
mhm.
engines, or is there like a subscription you have to you
So because of the high demand, you
okay.
can find free versions. Um, just I mean, just like with anything that's code or anything that's digital, like a movie. I mean, people want movies and they don't want to pay for them. So there's always going to be sites for torrenting movies, getting them for free illegally, you know.
Mm.
Doing AI art for free is not illegal. Anyone who has access to the code can use it however they like. That's generally been the idea from these companies like Stable AI.
Okay.
If you have the code, you can put it into like a Google Colab, which is like a it's like a web page with a bunch of code, and if you know coding, you know you can alter the code some, but a lot of them have really simple interfaces for you to input commands. There are some sites, and I'll mention Night Cafe, which you could I think just go to nightcafe.com, and they have a very simple interface. It's meant to just you type in a prompt and it spits out a picture. And they have different modifiers for like the style you want. I've done pictures where I've generated like pencil sketches of Keanu Reeves and they look just like him. I've
Wow.
generated like colorful ink art pictures of different celebrities. Celebrities are kind of easy to do because there's so many pictures for the system to reference.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and so I mean, I've been able to do art in the style of Leonid Afremov or like Josephine Wall or Thomas Kincaid. I mean, just and maybe like some lesser known people who are mainly known for their digital art on the internet. If their art is in the library of reference, then it can be used. This has actually caused a little bit of controversy because a lot of these artists have found that their work is in these libraries without their consent. Stable
Oh.
AI, yes. So that's if you hear controversy around AI art, this is usually the big one. Um, like all these artists, like the ones I just mentioned, largely did not consent to have their art as part of the library. Right now,
Right.
Stable AI is working on a second version of their AI art engine that takes all of those artworks out. So they're listening to their base. They're listening to everybody, and they're working on developing AI platforms that don't take artist work who haven't consented to that.
Yeah,
But
cause
yeah,
I was just gonna say like you
right,
putting anyone's face up there and like manipulating,
right,
it's gonna be like kind of messy. It's
right. I mean, there's definitely controversy around it. Yeah, I mean, using someone's face, and I mean, some controversies surrounding AI art are controversies that I think have been in the art world for a while and just revolve around tech in general. People are worried about how automation is displacing people from their jobs, which is an
mm-hmm.
argument that's as old as manual labor versus automated labor. I mean, so much we do that's been done in factories is now automated, and when that started happening, there was this pushback from the community of manual laborers who worked in factories who were being displaced from their jobs. So I think we live in a society that kind of tends towards automation, and I don't think it necessarily has to be bad. I think the argument that it is taking jobs away from, like, as we're talking about AI art, the argument that it takes jobs away from artists, I think really can be put into a bigger argument about how people should be able to live without having to sell their skill set.
Mm,
That's my personal reference. That's my personal opinion. That
okay.
yeah, I personally believe because especially when it comes to art, I mean, all the people who are arguing that art, um, I mean, everyone should be paid for their art. Everyone should be paid for their work. I believe in workers' rights. I believe in everyone's ability to support themselves. I think everyone should have that pathway.
Yeah.
And with artists, it's especially difficult because of how we tend to view art. But I do think there's an argument to be made that art is something that should be shared. I mean, I find it
Yeah.
hard to wrap my head around the idea that we should be gatekeeping anyone from doing art. Um, and if AI art makes art more accessible to people, I think we should accept that. I think we should welcome that. Um, but
Yeah.
I mean, it is tough. I mean, there's definitely the argument that people who might have gotten positions supplying certain images for certain companies. I mean, now it's so easy for those companies just to go to an AI art engine and generate a picture based on what they want.
See, I was just
So
gonna ask that too. Like, have you ever got backlash or like criticized by others because you do AI art? Like, people out there who are into traditional or digital art or other mediums of art, they might view AI art as, oh, they don't like it because of
right. And
what the reasons you
it's
just mentioned.
right. It's funny because this is an argument that I think kind of came about with the rise of Adobe and Photoshop. Photoshop made
True.
it easy to do a lot of art that artists were doing the arduous way. Artists
Mm,
were doing these you know these drawings and stuff by hand, all these and now with Photoshop, I mean, they've slowly integrated AI into their program over a long period of time. They had AI in their program before we had AI art generators. They have
wow.
tools that are like forget the names of them exactly. They're like spot cleaning, where like you can kind of brush over an area and the system uses AI to decide, if there's something that's there that shouldn't be and how to cover it up. So
Yeah.
AI has been part of art already and has largely made the job of a lot of artists easier. But there's always this argument of how technology makes things easier for an industry that already exists without it.
Yeah, because even what
So
you're saying. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, no, please continue.
Cause I was gonna mention too, like what you were saying about like how AI was also already kind of like in like photo editors. Like I've used a photo
Mhm.
editor where like if you wanted to crop a picture, it had like a smart crop, so you just like select the area and it will like
Right.
crop that section immediately. So
And
yeah.
there was a time where people complained about those systems because they
Mhm.
were like, "Well, I used to do that for hours for money, and now, right, and now the program can just do it in an instant."
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so that argument's always going to exist, and again, I think it really lends itself to a bigger argument about how people should be able to earn a living without having to sell their hobbies or their skills. I personally am in favor of basic universal income, but that's a conversation all on its
Yeah.
own. But I personally have not gotten backlash on doing AI art. I mean, I've seen the backlash in communities, and
Mhm.
I've seen certain communities specifically shut out AI art and AI artists, and in favor of more traditional types of art.
So
Um,
yeah.
but I've kind of found a bit of community with people who do AI art. And I think
Right.
that's the great thing about art is that it does create a community. It does allow you to make something and share with other people. I really think AI art and the joy behind it is it all goes back to the joy of art. And I think
Mhm.
that I mean there may be people who for reasons that they may be disabled, I mean who may struggle to do more traditional types of art, and AI art has given them that opportunity to express themselves in a new way that they couldn't before. So I think it's just important that we never really gatekeep anyone on
Yeah.
doing things like art. I mean art is just so base. It's just so human. And we
Yeah.
all I think have the right to express ourselves through art.
So do you feel like you see AI as becoming AI art becoming the future of all mediums of art, or do you feel like, traditional art and digital art will still be there as competitive?
I think so. If we look at AI art right now, and one thing we haven't talked about is that AI art is really not exact. I have made a lot of images that largely look great, but I mean, because it's AI art, you have things in it where if you look at the picture long enough, you realize it's not quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Like a piece of clothing that for some reason becomes like part of the skin, just
Okay.
things that the AI is not good at separating. Like it may not be able to like tell a dress from like the person's actual body, and so it's almost like the dress is becoming that person. Or hands are another big one. If you look at AI art, look at the hands. most of
Okay.
the time most of the time they're in crazy positions, just like, I mean, there's like fingers on the back of the hands or like going the opposite way. I mean, there's stuff like that you're going to see all throughout AI art. And I mean, there are people who use Photoshop in tandem with AI art. So, and I think that's one of the ways where it lends itself to the industry. People who are already good at Photoshop and were already editing photos can generate art and then just edit the parts that the AI didn't do very well.
Mm.
And I think that's, I mean, because of things like that, I do think the industry is going to tend towards automation, just like most industries do. It's just, it's cheaper. It's cheaper and easier, and that's generally good for anyone's business. Um,
But
so
do,
I think that's the reason why. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that being the reason why, but I do
yeah.
think that it will be the future for that reason.
But but do you feel like you will miss the element of humans like making errors or like just knowing a human
Right.
did the artwork?
Yeah, I think that is a part of art too. If you look at like certain modern art, there's you might have seen like news articles over the past few years of modern artists who put art up in a museum after they've been commissioned to do work, and they put up like blank paintings, or they put up like a banana taped to a wall.
Okay.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
I mean, the reason that art is interesting is not because of the art itself. I mean, if you look at it and you see a blank white canvas, you're like, well, why is that art? But then you hear the story behind it, and you hear that, I think in the case of one story that I read, he an artist put a blank white canvas in a museum or in a like an art showing, and the title of it was like "For a Paycheck" or something like that. I mean, like the whole right. I mean, the whole thing's like a joke, and you're like, oh, it's okay now with the context. I appreciate it. And
Yeah,
that if
yeah,
you got like a
yeah.
right, I mean, if you got like a blank white piece of art from an AI generator, you're like, well, this isn't art.
Right.
But and I think that's the case. I mean, you look at like um like Pablo Picasso. I mean, you see his art, and it's not like any of his stuff because of his style. I mean, none of his stuff looks like what reality looks like. It's a very specific style.
Right.
And and I mean that is the thing that kind of makes art human. And like just knowing about like the background
The story,
of the
yeah.
artwork. Right. I mean, for
Mhm.
so many people, like you see a work of art and you're like, "Oh, I wonder what the artist meant." And then like sometimes knowing what the artist's intent was, you realize like, "Oh, wow, this is really a work of art."
Mhm.
And and that's what makes art so unique. I mean, some people might appreciate that, like with the blank canvas. I mean, you laughed. I mean, it's funny. But other people
Right.
might hear that and be like, "That's dumb." But that's the very nature of art. It's all our interpretation of it. So
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
I think there are still going to be people who continue to make art because making art is fun, doing it by hand, and it's interesting when AI becomes the norm. The people who are really going to be able to push past it are the people who are going to be able to present their artwork in an authentic way. People, like if they're like, well, I can just generate a hand-drawn picture of Harry Potter, and someone else says, well, I actually drew the picture myself. Who else
Right.
can hand draw this picture as well as I can?
Right.
And or in the style that I can. I mean, and that's
Mhm.
another aspect is that there are styles that have yet to really be invented in art, and the AI system can't pick up on a style that doesn't exist yet.
Right. That's
And
true.
so we still need humans to kind of push
Mhm.
the frontier of innovation.
Right.
So, I mean, AI can do a lot of things, automation can do a lot of things, but it can't replace people.
That's true. But do you feel still like in a way that traditional artists will still have to kind of adapt to like the new world of art?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
but that's life for all of us in all facets of
Yeah.
our lives. I
Yeah.
mean, there's always change, and we always have to be able to adapt to that change in a meaningful way.
Yep. That's what being a human being is about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I didn't I forgot to ask you this earlier, but how long have you been doing AI art, and like how did you get into it? Like do you remember like that first time you first heard of it, and like the first time you tried it out?
Yeah, so it was a little earlier this year that I think that these systems really became popular. I don't know if they've been around for longer than this year, but
Okay.
it was earlier in this year that I read about DAL-E, which was I think the first like really popular one. It was the
Mhm.
first one that was like everyone was talking about how you could put in a prompt and it spits out a picture.
Mhm.
And DALL-E was really good. And then I think then we started to see Mid-Journey and Stable Diffusion come around, and then Google came out with DALL-E 2, which
Yeah.
is an advanced version. And with all those articles coming out, I was like, I mean, I've always loved doing art. And
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest struggles I've had is how expensive and how time consuming it is. It's hard to fit into someone's schedule.
Yeah.
And I mean, for people who are really passionate about it and they've maybe already spent years building up to a point where they have pipelines ready, so they're like, I've already got this stuff in my garage. I have paint, I have all the stuff I need for a project, or they've got all the tools they need. For all of those people, they've probably already worked out the issues of resource management and how they do their art. But I've never really had that opportunity. I've never been very good at like drawing. I mean, I can barely write well. I can't. I'm just not
Okay.
good at that aspect of art. I've
Okay.
tried. I
Yeah.
tried a lot when I was young, and I'm sure with more practice, I would have improved. But I mean, there's just the amount of time I have to spend on art, it's difficult for me to build up those pipelines of like, okay, now I've got these tools and I know the techniques and I've got the paints and whatever else I need. It's difficult to build those up when you're only doing art every now and then.
Right.
So AI art has been a way for me to like really produce something complete. And that's been a very deeply fulfilling feeling to
Mhm.
to and with AI art, I mean, you do to some extent have to what they call like you have to train it. You have to figure out which prompts really spit out the image that you like.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, for people who can get a consistent style in AI art, that takes time. That
Yeah,
takes
definitely.
lots of practice.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I mean, for me, AI art has just been like another facet of art. And yeah, I mean, the more I've learned about it, the more I want to do. Right now, I'm working on an AI animation, which is kind of picking up steam. More and more people are trying to do AI animations where you basically take a frame from a video, you go frame by frame and generate art over every frame
Okay.
so that as you play them in sequence, you see AI objects, moving as they would be animated.
Interesting.
Um, yeah. I it's really cool. I mean, animation is just it's another one of those things where I've always really wanted to get into it, and this is kind of giving me the pathway to do that.
Okay. Now I've also what I saw today. I don't know if you heard of an app called Lensa. I'm not. I don't remember the name, but
Yes, I'm familiar.
yeah. But I just saw something where like celebrities were using their face, like I guess profile pictures or whatever, using the Lensa app and like creating different things. So like I was gonna ask you too. Do you feel like would in what ways do you think AI art can influence and like change the world as far as with social media and like influencers and everything?
Right. So Linza is definitely a really good example.
Hmm.
Um, Linza, and I'm not like a coding expert, so I mean,
Yeah.
I know very, very little, and this whole endeavor has really been my intro into coding.
Yeah.
But um, Linza is essentially an AI that has been trained on very specific parameters so that when it scans images, it breaks them down into certain elements and then recreates them. It takes those elements as though they were like a prompt for an AI image and it recreates, your picture based on a real picture. And
Okay.
yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, as we've seen, there are pictures from Linza where like some of them really look like the people who did it. You know, you probably have seen people where you're like, wow, those pictures really look like my friend. I
Yeah.
can't believe that. And yeah, I mean, it's just inherently cool AI
Mhm.
art. I mean, all the things it can do. I mean, one of the ways I really started to get interested in AI animation is through social media. I first saw other people post videos where they were doing AI generated over frame by frame and turning it into an animation. I was like,
Mhm.
that is amazing. That is so cool to see something just like a video turned into something totally new based on the interpretation of a computer. I
Okay.
mean, there's just something about that that I think really just piques everyone's curiosity and, you know, inspires them to do the same. And
Yeah.
that's, you know, why we're seeing it everywhere now.
Yeah, I just found that interesting because I saw that earlier before we start this conversation. I was like, oh, speaking of AI art, and I'm about to have a conversation about AI art. But yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And I don't know if you've seen it, there's already a backlash. There's
Oh
already a
no.
backlash to it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Linza is considered one of the apps that might have taken artworks from people who did not consent. So again,
Oh.
there are companies working on that issue, but yeah, I mean, I think we're going to definitely live in a world where AI is going to be a big part of our lives, I think. In the same way that some of us remember like the dawn of the internet, I think
Okay.
we're going to
Right.
have a dawn of the AI
Okay.
where we're going to be old one day and we're going to be like, man, I don't understand how this AI works. And it's like it's in every aspect of my life now.
Oh my goodness. You
Yeah, I
you
mean,
be like my grandchildren are half AI.
right,
Oh no,
exactly.
that sounds
You
kind
have
of
to call your
scary.
grandkids and be like, can you tell me how my AI shower works? I don't understand it. Yeah.
Definitely. So
Yeah.
so do you see AI art becoming like a good side hustle for people? Like, do you think there's some ways people can gain revenue as an AI artist?
I have personally looked into it.
Okay.
Um, it's difficult. I mean, even if you're really, really good, it's difficult. And the biggest reason is because the market is so flooded already. I mean,
Okay.
because it's easy to generate a picture in less than a minute. So I mean, you can generate thousands of pictures in a day.
That's
And
true.
so the market, and I mean, in some cases, you don't necessarily even have to train the AI. If you type in a basic prompt, you might get a really, truly amazing picture just because of the interpretation of the AI made it that way.
Okay.
And so you have, I mean, if you go that route, you're not going to have a consistent style, and you may put a lot of work into it, and you're able to generate something consistent, but it's kind of undercut by someone who might have created something similar to your style with just a very simple prompt because they happen to stumble onto it.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it can be hard to make money off of it. For a lot of people who are making the argument that like a lot of AI artists are like pushing other artists out of the industry. I mean, if it comes to like, you know, buying art off of Etsy or something like that, I think those artists are still fine. I mean, it's just so hard to sell AI art with so much of it already out there. I mean,
Yeah.
people are already starting to gloss over the images of being like, and even though AI art can be something that inspires and it intrigues you, there is also the opposite effect where you're like, well, that didn't really take them any work or time, so that's less interesting. I think we also
Mm.
kind of have that reaction. When you know something's AI, you're like, oh, well, that's cool, but they didn't make that, so it's
Right.
not like, you know, I mean, so and that's kind of going back to our earlier point. If you see something like a truly amazing painting, especially if it's like really realistic, and you know someone made it by hand, you're like, that's impressive.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that feeling makes you want to buy it, makes you want to own it. You can look at it and know when you look at it, someone painstakingly painted this
Yes, with their
to this
brain.
accuracy. Right. And I think both sides of it are interesting and I think it's totally possible to embrace both
Yeah.
aspects.
So let me ask you, what goals do you have for yourself as an AI artist? Like, what purpose do you feel like your art would serve to yourself, your supporters, or to the world?
So my personal goal with AI art has been I've really wanted to try to find a way to nail down some really good AI animation. I've started on it and some of it looks okay, but for it to really look amazing, I have to actually really put in some artistic effort. And the reason why I want to do this is because I actually like to make music.
Ah,
And
cool.
I really wanted um I'm like every time I make music and I want to like put something out there, I always have this drive to like turn it into like a music video. There's something about music videos to me that are just so cool and like just the addition, just the combination of art mediums. I feel like the it becomes greater than its
Right.
parts, you
Yeah,
know?
definitely.
And so that has been kind of my personal goal is to find a way to make AI animation in a way that is meaningful and that synthesizes well with the music that I'm making so that I can kind of make these little music videos that I present to the world. And I mean, it's all just it's mostly for fun. I mean, I just love that feeling of like I see a music video that I made, everything is to completion. I made the song and it's mastered and I
Mm-hmm.
made the video and that took me a long time, but I finally got it where I wanted it. And then it's a complete project, just like anyone feels with any art that they complete.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that I mean that's the feeling I'm chasing, is just having that thing where I'm like, I made this, this is cool. This is something where like if I saw it outside of my perspective objectively, I would be like, that's a cool thing. And I want to know that I did that.
Yeah, yeah.
so so that's really, I mean, that's been my goal. I personally, I mean, I have not tried very hard to like make money from AI art or anything because that's really not the fun part. The fun
Okay.
part is the making of the art, the process, and then having that finished result and knowing that you got there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's nothing like seeing the things you had in mind, the vision you have for your project, like actually getting to see it for the first time, you know.
Yeah.
It's definitely like a beautiful thing. You're like, "Oh, finally after all that that time and energy
Right.
I put into it, it's there."
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, lastly, with this topic, what advice do you have for people wanting to get into AI art, or maybe they just want to learn more about AI art in general?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of resources out there. I would check out some of the engines that I mentioned.
Hmm.
Night Cafe, which utilizes a version of DALI and Stable Diffusion, as well as a few other different engines. So there's a lot to explore there. It does cost a little bit of money. I believe that it basically translates to like $1 a picture. But
Okay.
I yeah, I everyone who might be listening should check it out for themselves. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a great entry point. If you're trying to look for something for free, if you type into Google Stable Diffusion, Google Collab, you'll find free versions of it that are a little more technical. So you might have to watch like a YouTube video on how to interact with it exactly. But there are so many resources. And because it's
Hmm.
so new, I mean, there's so much free information out there from people on YouTube, especially. I've gotten a lot of my tutorials on YouTube. And yeah, I think if you do the research, there's information out there.
Well, you heard them, people. Just check it out. It doesn't hurt to try. That's the main thing.
Yes, it's worth it.
So lastly, with some closing thoughts here, Oneros, with 2023 coming very soon, what are some goals? Because you could, like, when we think of the new year, we think of, like, personal goals we may want to do for ourselves, but what are some goals you would like to see the world accomplish? Like, if you had to give the world its own New Year's resolution, what would you like to see?
I would like to see everybody love each other genuinely. I would like to see everyone want to see the good in everyone else and be willing to put in the work to see the good in everyone else.
Amen to that. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So what's next for you this upcoming year?
Um, for me, I'm definitely going to be working on more music. I'm also very new to music, something I've only been doing for the last few years. I mean, kind of on and off my whole life, but I've really gotten serious about it lately. So I'm hoping to increase those skills and continue to work on AI art and animation.
Okay.
And with COVID, I unfortunately lost contact with a lot of my support system and the community that I had.
Okay.
And I'm now in a brand new place. So the goal for the next year is to try to work on rebuilding a support system in a community.
Yeah, I feel, I feel that happens sometimes. Like, things come up in life, and you kind of do like lose certain things. You lose and gain things. So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
but as long as you keep going, that's what's important. So yeah.
Yes.
So Ohnearohs, do you have any other thoughts you may want to say to those who are listening to this video or your supporters?
Yeah, I would double down on a statement earlier that if you are struggling with neurodivergency, you are not alone. There are so many people who are feeling the same thing, and I know from personal experience that putting in the work every day does help. There's so many points along the way where you're working on yourself and you wonder if you're ever going to look back and see that you've grown.
Mm-hmm.
And those, I just want to say that those moments do happen. You put in the work, and you'll find that even if it takes years, you're going to look back and see that you've become a closer to the ideal version of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, you know what? Thanks a bunch, Ohnearohs. This has been amazing to have you join my platform. And like I said earlier, I truly appreciate your time and your consideration to share your story, your experience, your thoughts. And just overall, I wish you like great success with your art journey, and I hope you like continue to make a great like positive impact on the world. So like keep it up, like seriously. So
Well, thank you. I hope that I can have a positive impact too.
yeah,
And thank you for
definitely.
having me on this. This was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you for joining once again, because you didn't have to, waste your time here, but you did. So I truly appreciate it. So all right, guys. With that being said, if you heard anything today that helped you or inspired you in some way, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And also, please check out, subscribe to Ohnearohs' social media links. His social media links will be down in the description below. And also, I'll leave a link to where you can see some of his artwork. So, yeah. So, all right, guys. See you guys in the next one. Hope you enjoyed the video and take care.